everyone, Alexa Donne here, and today I am talking all about starting your novel in the right place. Now, this is kind of a buzzy phrase that you may have heard, especially if anyone has ever told you, if you've heard people tell other writers, I think you're starting your book in the wrong place. You hear this because it's really critical to start your book in the right place. Ideally, you want to start with a scene that illustrates character, conflict, world, and ideally also stakes. Now, this is a tall order. There's a lot to accomplish in whatever your opening scene/chapter is. And essentially what people mean when they say that you're starting in the wrong place is your pacing is off. If you start too early, your pacing is going to drag. It's going to feel slow. And if you start too late, your pacing is going to feel too fast. You're throwing people into a situation, usually an action scene, where they don't know what's going on, they don't know who people are, and they don't have a reason to care. So you kind of have to strike that balance between boring people to tears and confusing the heck out of them. There's that kind of middle ground. My best advice is to think about starting your novel the day that it all changes, or alternately 15 minutes before it all changes. Not necessarily literally, by the way. You want to think of it kind of abstractly as, what is the thing that happens right before the big change happens? The big change being your inciting incident. Very often the answer to this question will tell you where you might want to start your novel. In many cases, this is going to be a slice of life of kind of who your characters are and kind of what their life is about before everything changes. But that said, you want to be careful not to make it boring. A play-by-play of everything that your character does in their life, their normal life, is going to be, frankly, boring. You have to think more dynamic than that. Whatever scene you choose, as I mentioned, is going to have to perform all of those functions, introducing character, the world, the conflict, and the stakes. And often part of this is introducing multiple characters, how they relate to each other, and how they tie into the conflict and the stakes. You want this scene to be interesting and specific. Whatever you choose should say something about your character and your world. That said, this shouldn't be like a massive info dump. Now, I've said it before and I will say it again, and that said, don't all start your books this way, but one of my favorite ways to accomplish this is through party scenes. Party scenes tell you a lot about the character, the world that they live in, how they interact with people, and you can throw a lot of conflict into a party scene. This, by the way, might not be the literal start to your book, but a party scene or something similar to it, you want to think of other dynamic social situations that are kind of similar to what a party is. Having that kind of in that first part of your book before the inciting incident can be really, really useful. I have indeed started 2 books like right in the middle of a party scene, and I rather like them. It can work really, really well. You also want to remember the adage of entering late and leaving early. You don't need to have a prolonged setup of whatever it is, of like, again, the play-by-play of everything that a character is doing. You want to throw people into the scene when things are basically kind of already happening, and then you want to leave before they peter out and get boring. I mean, this is the rule of thumb for any scene, but especially your opening scene. If you start too early, essentially, and it's not dynamic and it's boring, people won't read past the first page. Now, I want to talk a bit about prologues. You've also probably heard that you shouldn't start your book with a prologue, and I'm going to reinforce that advice. I'd say 98% of the time do not have a prologue. The reason for this is that very, very typically, especially in things like fantasy and sci-fi, the prologue is from a different point of view, or a different perspective, or takes place in a different time than the main thrust of your story and your main character. And so prologues can be really off-putting, they can be confusing, and they don't accurately give the reader an idea of what your book is actually about. This is especially prudent for querying because you really only get that one chance for agents to read your first page. But even when it comes to readers picking up your book in a bookstore, a prologue could potentially put them off the story. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rules. There are prologues that definitely work. If you have a favorite book and it has a really effective prologue, take a look at it. I will say typically they're pretty short. They are in line with the tone and the themes of the book, and they typically aren't from a completely different perspective or point of view from the main character. Sometimes they are, but the ones that I like and why that I think work don't do those things. Prologues just kind of slow down the pacing because beginnings really are all about pacing. Now, I want to give you some concrete examples of openings to YA books that I think work really, really well. It's tricky to kind of talk in the abstract about, well, how you should start your novel. I mean, I just did it. I gave you some of these parameters for what you should and shouldn't do. But I find most useful is looking at novels that start really, really well. You can start to pick them apart and see why they work. So I'm going to start with my perennial and favorite example, which is The Hunger Games. We open with Katniss, and it's actually fairly domestic. It's essentially that slice of life, that day in the life. It is also the day that everything changes for her. So by showing us Katniss interacting with and taking care of her family, The Hunger Games tells you a lot about the character of Katniss and the characters that she interacts with, and a lot about the world. It gradually starts to reveal kind of who this character is, the world that they live in. From home, she goes hunting and interacting with Gale and the conversation that they have about the reaping and taking care of their families and how your name goes in the bowl more than once if you break the rules, etc. It tells you a lot about the oppressive world that they're living in, and also literally, is barreling you towards that inciting incident. It's dynamic, it's interesting. As you're reading, you're like, oh, well, this is weird, what's going on? I think it's incredibly effective. So obviously this isn't a single scene. This is a series of dynamic character and world specific scenes that drive you neatly to the reaping. So by the time you get there, you know who Katniss is, you know where she lives, you know who she cares about most importantly. So when everything happens with the reaping and Prim, you have an emotional reaction. You are furiously turning the pages to find out what happens next. Another favorite of mine is actually a bit prologue-y, but it works really, really well, and that is Across the Universe by Beth Revis, meaning the first chapter of Across the Universe takes place hundreds of years before the main thrust of the action of Across the Universe, but it is an essential glimpse into the past and setup because it sets up the entire novel. You're with Amy, you're in her perspective, she's with her parents, she's made the decision to be cryogenically frozen and go on this spaceship, and you're with her as she's going through this process, and she's giving you the context of where she is and why, which fills in the backstory and also sets up again the conflict and the stakes, because we get the chance to meet her parents and get a sense of who Amy is and what she cares about, where she's going and why, so that in the following chapters, when it's a couple hundred years later, she wakes up and the plot kicks off. It's a very tightly paced novel. You're already emotionally invested. Very, very good opening, good specific choice for where we start with our character leading up to the inciting incident. I don't think it would have been quite as effective if it had started on the spaceship with Amy waking up. I think having that glimpse into the past is really essential in the case of this novel for setting up the plot and the characters. Then there is Frostblood, which is actually another good example of a prologue that is not a prologue. See, if you know how these things work, you can cheat and basically do the same function. Because the first chapter of Frostblood is essentially kind of like a flashback. It isn't, but it is. It takes place a year before everything else in the novel, like the main plot, takes place. And it is the setup of who Ruby is, the world that she lives in. Again, does this sound familiar? The characters that she cares about, and then it nails you right at the end of the first chapter with the conflict and stakes, because her mother is murdered in front of her because of her. So you get her guilt and her feelings, and of course why she would have a drive for revenge, which is what fuels the rest of the plot. And that wasn't a spoiler because it is basically on the jacket flap that Ruby's mom dies. But that is, it's a very exciting setup because it starts showing her secretly using her powers. You know immediately that they're forbidden, that she shouldn't be doing this, that she lives with her mother and her mother is all she has. And then it, the soldiers come to town and, immediately it's like, oh God, conflict, stakes, what's gonna happen? So that's another example that I really, really like. And just talking a bit about some of the choices I have made in my books and how I have started off my novels. I actually tend to favor that slice of life, day in the life approach. I like to settle into the characters and their world and who they are before I smack them in the face with the inciting incidents. So in Brightly Burning, it's really mundane, relatively speaking, the way that I start the book. I hope it's not boring. It's mundane in the sense that it is kind of normal everyday life stuff. But in the case of, where Stella lives, normal everyday life stuff is a bit chaotic. The book starts with a gravity failure and she has to go to engineering to basically fix the ship. So you know that Stella lives on a ship that has problems. She is an engineer, so she's responsible for fixing those problems. I clue you in really quick to the fact that she hates her job and is trying to escape. She wants to become a governess, a teacher on another ship. And, in that, first couple of chapters leading up to the inciting incident, which happens in, I should know my own book, I want to say chapter 3 or 4, which is later than a lot of inciting incidents. You don't always have to stick to chapter 1 or chapter 2, your inciting incident. It's all a buildup of where she lives, the things that she's facing, the things that she wants, and why she can't have them, and then, inciting incident, she gets what she wants and she goes off on her adventure. Then in my new book, so Space Songs, this would be my NaNoWriMo project, which is a follow-up. As I said, I start with a party. I really love parties. So I just go right into it. There's a party. I introduce the whole cast of characters and kind of how they interact with their world. This start is very, very different to Brightly Burning. Brightly Burning it starts immediately telegraphing to you, this is a ship that is falling apart. Things are not going great. Whereas in my new book, in Space Angst, it's set on a very different ship and in a different time in the fleet for my world build. And so I'll just tell you, from a class perspective, it's a very different experience. It's a fancy party. I talk about the food and the drinks and how people are dressed. There's lots of dress porn and kind of who is interacting with whom and why it matters. Though in this case, I did stick that inciting incident right at the end of the first chapter. So you have to kind of go with your gut for what beginning and what pacing is going to work for your novel project. Also in the case of Space Songs, I do the case of enter late and leave early. I start kind of smack dab in the middle of the party. It's almost reached its peak. My character is kind of totally over it. I have her interact with a bunch of people and then she leaves before the party ends to go deal with stuff that is plotty stuff. So you definitely always want to think about that. It would have been boring if I'd started it, she's at her closet and she's picking out a dress and she puts on her shoes and she walks to the party and what does the party look like? It would have dragged. Whereas I started right in the meat of it so that I could move the plot along. So those are my main tips for starting your novel in the right place. Think about slice of life, think about right before the inciting incident, think dynamic, scenes that show off character, world, conflict, and stakes. Who is in your character's life? Why are they important to them? what's in their way. Think about scenes that are going to illustrate this without having massive info dumps, people just talking at each other. These need to be scenes where things happen and people interact with each other, and there are micro conflicts within the scene. Katniss interacting with her mom and her sister in very different ways, those are micro conflicts. Katniss hunting and running into Gale, there are micro conflicts in those scenes, and there are conversations that people have, but they're not too info dumping. They're having these conversations for an organic reason. So think about some of those examples in terms of how you are starting your novel. I hope this helped, though definitely drop some comments down below. This is how I approach starting novels, but I'm sure there are things that I haven't thought of, and so if you have specific questions, definitely hit me up with them. I will answer them in the comments, or if they spark a new idea, I will make another video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you liked this one, I'd love a thumbs up. It lets me know that you like the craft videos so I can make more of them. Good luck starting those novels or revising those novels if you think you're starting in the wrong place. And as always, everyone, happy writing.